The era that began in 1837 with Queen Victoria's ascension to the throne reshaped not only the social fabric of England, but also that of Europe as a whole. During this time, England prospered through the sweeping economic changes of the Industrial Revolution, while the empire's borders stretched across the globe. London emerged as the centre not just of political power, but also of culture, fashion and societal values. Yet, behind this grandeur and display of dominance lay a deeply ingrained hypocrisy. The Victorian era was notorious for its rigid moral codes. Women were expected to embody modesty and virtue, while men were to maintain the image of gentlemanly conduct. Conversations, attire, gestures, even the very manner of walking were scrutinized through the lens of respectability. Society could not tolerate even the faintest rumor. A minor breach of moral expectations could utterly destroy one's reputation. But the irony was striking. Behind the facade of virtue, countless hidden lives thrived. Outwardly, innocence was staged for public display, while behind closed doors, an entirely different reality unfolded. This contradiction was most evident within the institution of marriage. To outsiders, Victorian marriage symbolized loyalty, harmony, and respectability. Queen Victoria's relationship with Prince Albert was glorified as the ultimate ideal, celebrated in newspapers, paintings, and palace gossip as the pinnacle of romance and devotion. Yet, the marriages of ordinary citizens, and even the aristocracy, rarely mirrored this idealized image. Victorian society did not build marriage upon love, but upon duty, status, and economy. For women, marriage was nearly the sole purpose of life. Finding a good husband was both a responsibility to one's family and the only means of securing a stable future. Education, career, or independence were not considered viable options. Society defined women solely through their roles as wives and mothers. An unmarried woman risked being labeled a spinster, ridiculed, and socially excluded. For men, marriage often served as a tool to strengthen social standing. A well-matched union could open doors to career advancement, political alliances, or the expansion of wealth. Love matches were rare and often dismissed as frivolous. The priority lay in practicality, advantage, and public approval. The bitter reality, however, was that marriage for women resembled a cage rather than a gateway to freedom. Legally, a woman became her husband's property after marriage. Any assets she owned, or income she might earn, were transferred to him. Custody of children belonged solely to the father. In essence, marriage stripped women of their identity, rendering them legally invisible. The mask of happiness and virtue conveniently concealed this despair. While newspapers painted idyllic portraits of family life, the reality for many households was marred by conflict, violence, and silent suffering. Women were silenced, and divorce was almost impossible. The chasm between the public display of respectability and the private experience of misery only grew wider. To fully grasp the Victorian moral framework, one must understand that it was an age of double standards. Men were afforded freedoms beyond marriage, extramarital affairs were tolerated, and the sex trade thrived under their patronage. Women, on the other hand, were harshly condemned for the slightest transgression, facing lifelong disgrace. Thus, the romanticized image of the Victorian era, graceful balls, opulent homes, and polished gentlemen, represents only the surface. Behind that facade lay a darker reality, a society that suppressed women's freedom, reduced marriage to a contract of necessity, and eclipsed love under the weight of duty and control. For this reason, Victorian marriages were far more oppressive and somber than the polished exterior would ever suggest. To truly understand Victorian marriage, one must first consider the mindset of the age. Marriage in this era was not primarily a matter of individual choice, but rather part of the shared interests of families, society, and even the state. For both men and women, marriage was not viewed in terms of personal emotions as we understand them today. The purpose of marriage was not to seek love or happiness, but to preserve order, reinforce social standing, and secure economic stability. From the outset, marriage was less a matter of the heart than an institution shaped by strict rules and calculated interests. For women, this reality was far more dramatic. From a young age, their upbringing, education, manners, and family values were directed toward one singular goal: finding a suitable husband. A girl was taught above all else to behave as a proper lady, to be graceful, and to cultivate marriageable qualities. The books she read, the music or foreign languages she studied, or the skills she acquired in sewing or household management were not intended to enrich her intellect, but to make her more appealing to a future husband. A woman's worth was measured not by her knowledge or abilities, but by her dowry, her family's reputation, and the benefits she could bring to her husband. Remaining unmarried was considered a great failure. Unmarried women were branded with humiliating labels, excluded from social life, and often treated as burdens even by their own families. Spinsterhood meant losing economic security and facing poverty in old age, since it was nearly impossible for women to earn their own income. Those from wealthy families could sometimes survive on inherited property, but for women of the middle or lower classes, marriage was the only viable escape from hardship. For men, the situation was different. Marriage was seen as a sign of maturity and reliability. A married man was viewed as more respectable in society and more trustworthy in business. An unmarried man might be accused of irresponsibility, though he did not face the same dire consequences as a woman. Men could pursue education, enter professions, and establish themselves independently. Still, for middle-class men in particular, marriage was considered a crucial step for career advancement, as it marked them as serious and stable, opening the door to greater opportunities. Most marriages were built on economic and social considerations. Dowries, inheritances, and property arrangements formed the foundation of the institution. A woman's dowry, for example, was not for her own security, but was absorbed into her husband's estate, increasing his wealth. Marriage was less about two individuals uniting than about two families merging. Through marriage, fortunes were combined, lands transferred, and political alliances secured. The personal feelings of the bride and groom were often overshadowed by these broader calculations. Among the upper classes, marriage resembled a chess game. The daughter of a lord might marry the son of another aristocrat to strengthen her family's power, while gaining access to the other family's wealth. Such unions were often arranged before the couple had even met. In some cases, a young woman might not see her future husband until the wedding day itself, underscoring just how little marriage was connected to personal happiness. Love, in this system, had little space. People did fall in love, of course, but love and marriage were often separate matters. If a woman wished to marry purely for love, her family might treat it as a scandal. A marriage without family approval could lead to disinheritance, social exile, and complete loss of reputation. As a result, love matches were rare and often ended tragically. The great love stories immortalized in literature were often reflections of struggles against these rigid societal pressures. The hypocrisy of Victorian society is also striking. Outwardly, families projected images of happy marriages, going to great lengths to display unity and stability. Yet behind closed doors, many marriages were marked by unhappiness, lack of affection, and relationships based on pure convenience. A woman's life goal was to marry, but once married, she often lost all agency over her own life. A man's goal was respectability, but marriage rarely provided genuine emotional fulfillment. Thus, while Victorian marriages appeared to uphold the pillars of a moral and orderly society, in reality they often eroded individuality, chained women to oppressive roles, and devalued love itself. Happiness was frequently sacrificed at the altar of calculation, social standing, and relentless societal expectations. Victorian marriages, from the outside, might have appeared innocent and charming, with their elaborate rules, romantic letters, lavish weddings, and the institution's exaltation as sacred in the eyes of society. Yet when the curtain is lifted, this picture transforms, especially for women, into a dark, oppressive, and often painful reality. Marriage at the time was not merely the emotional union of two individuals. It was also an economic, social, and moral control mechanism. It was an institution that stripped women of their freedom while consolidating male power. When a woman married, she did not just change her surname, she also lost her legal identity. Under the English law system known as coverture, a married woman's legal existence was absorbed by her husband's. She was no longer an independent individual, but considered an extension of her husband. Any wages, inheritance, or property a woman possessed automatically transferred to her husband upon marriage. This applied not only to poor women, but also to those from noble and wealthy families. Even the dowry or wealth a daughter brought into a marriage would fall under her husband's control. In essence, a woman secured her life by handing over her future to her husband. Motherhood was another area of intense control. In Victorian society, a woman fulfilled her societal duty by becoming a mother, but even this role was subject to her husband's authority. Children were legally the father's property. No matter how devoted she was, a mother had no legal claim over her children. In cases of divorce or separation, women often had to watch their children taken away and given to the father. This forced many mothers into silence and compliance. No matter how unhappy they were, they endured harmful marriages to keep their children close. Another heavy burden of Victorian marriage was the social roles imposed on women. They were expected to be the angelic wife and selfless mother. Their duty was to maintain the household, raise the children, and obey their husbands. If a woman dared to dream, pursue personal goals, or assert herself, society would immediately accuse her of selfishness or immorality. Women's education, intellectual pursuits, or public visibility were often discouraged. The societal ideal trapped them as the angel of the house, a figure who, despite appearing graceful, was imprisoned in reality. The disparity between women's domestic roles and men's freedoms was staggering. Men were free to act as they wished outside the home. In Victorian London, brothels existed on nearly every corner, and tens of thousands of women were forced into prostitution. While this lifestyle for men was widely known, it was mostly ignored. The state regulated women, not men. Prostitutes were subjected to mandatory health inspections, while men's reckless behavior was largely tolerated. This stark double standard was one of the clearest indicators of inequality within the institution of marriage. One of the darkest realities women faced was domestic violence. At the time, family matters were considered private, beyond the reach of society or the law. Husbands could yell at, beat, or mistreat their wives with little legal consequence. Legal recourse was extremely difficult. Divorce was both expensive and socially shameful. Women seeking divorce had to provide strong evidence of adultery or other severe faults, while male infidelity was often ignored. As a result, thousands of women were trapped in lifelong marriages filled with unhappiness and abuse. Despite these harsh realities, Victorian marriages were adorned with romantic stories, idealized family images, and religious values. Society viewed families as virtuous, orderly, and sacred. Yet this facade concealed the harsh truths women endured. Male social and legal dominance, combined with women's lives bound by invisible chains, defined the essence of Victorian marriage. In Victorian marriages, a woman's daily life was often governed by rigid rules and limitations, almost like a ritual. Upon waking, her first task was to organize the day around household chores and family responsibilities. Every object, piece of furniture, and accessory in the home fell under her management. When guests were expected, she was responsible for every detail, from arranging the parlor to presenting the meals. Any failure in these duties was seen by society as a sign of inadequacy and could tarnish her family's reputation. Expressing personal desires was nearly forbidden. Love, personal ambitions, or career aspirations were suppressed even before marriage by families and for married women. Asserting their own wishes was even more perilous. Any behavior displeasing to her husband could not only disrupt harmony at home, but also damage her social standing. Men, however, were not held to the same standard. Societal norms often excused or even encouraged their behavior. A woman's position in the household depended entirely on her husband's authority. A man could scold, physically punish, or treat her coldly, and the law offered her little protection. Even if she wished to seek divorce, the difficulty, cost, and risk of losing her children often silenced her. Women had to endure unhappiness and mistreatment, as social stigma and economic dependence left them with no alternative. This helplessness was masked by society's portrayal of the virtuous family. From the outside, households appeared happy, children well-behaved, and homes immaculate. Women's sacrifices, patience, and silence were praised as virtues. Yet in reality, these virtues were chains that restricted freedom and forced women to live according to their husbands' desires and society's expectations. Societal pressures extended beyond the home into public life. A woman's behavior, speech, clothing, posture, and tone of voice were constantly scrutinized. Even the smallest misstep could lead to gossip, criticism, and the tarnishing of family honor. Men, on the other hand, were subject to far looser standards. Their social behavior had far fewer boundaries. This double standard turned marriage into both a psychological and societal pressure cooker for women. Divorce in the Victorian era was nearly impossible for women. A woman could only seek it in cases of severe wrongdoing or neglect, and she had to provide substantial evidence, such as adultery. Men, in similar circumstances, were much more easily forgiven. Divorce could completely destroy a woman's reputation, leading to social ostracism. Remarriage was extremely difficult, as society labeled divorced women as failures. Many women therefore chose to endure years of abusive or unhappy marriages in silence. Another dark aspect of marriage was a woman's complete lack of sexual autonomy. Sexuality was considered a duty. Her pleasure or consent was irrelevant. A woman was expected to satisfy her husband's needs, and failure to do so could lead to social condemnation as a neglectful wife. Couples often slept in separate beds, reflecting society's view of sexuality as forbidden and unspeakable. A woman's body belonged to her husband, not herself. All of these conditions turned Victorian marriage into a struggle for survival for women. They were forced to suppress their identities and desires, accepting the limited security and status that marriage offered. Men, on the other hand, gained power and privilege from this system, using society's double standards to act as they wished. What made Victorian marriages so oppressive was not just the power imbalance between individuals, but also the laws, social norms, and economic structures that reinforced it. Women were silenced, men were protected, and love and equality were almost entirely absent. Homes that appeared respectable, orderly, and happy from the outside were, in reality, spaces where women were chained, deprived of freedom, and subjected to a quiet and invisible form of torment. In the Victorian era, marriage was not just a family or economic arrangement, it had become a social instrument that completely shaped women's lives. From a young age, girls were prepared for this system. Their education, social behavior, and personal development were all directed toward one goal: becoming a good wife. Yet once married, the role they had been groomed for over years became a prison in real life. Women could no longer make their own decisions, manage their own income, or assert legal rights over their children. Their entire lives were dictated by their husband's will and society's expectations, while love and happiness were often relegated to secondary importance. The psychological pressures within marriage profoundly affected women's daily lives. Women constantly felt scrutinized at home, forced to measure every word and action. Even minor acts of disobedience or behaviors deemed inappropriate could provoke their husband's anger, trigger family conflict, or spark social gossip. As a result, women frequently had to suppress their own feelings, remain silent, and practice patience. The internalized anger, disappointment, and unhappiness became a constant inner struggle for many women. The roles society imposed left long-lasting effects on a woman's psyche. She was expected to be a perfect homemaker and a selfless mother. Maintaining the household, preparing meals on time, raising children, and entertaining guests were all her responsibility. Yet the husband might be unaware of her efforts, and no matter how much she labored, recognition was not guaranteed. This reinforced feelings of inadequacy and guilt, severely undermining self-esteem. Another dark aspect of marriage was the prevalence of abuse and mistreatment. Women were legally unprotected against their husband's anger, physical punishment, or psychological coercion. Divorce or separation was rarely possible due to financial constraints and social stigma. Most women chose to remain silent in long-lasting, unhappy, and often abusive marriages. This silence was reinforced by societal norms. Women's complaints were largely ignored, and social support or solidarity was almost non-existent. Control over sexuality was another way in which women's freedom was curtailed. A woman's sexuality was largely viewed as a duty to her husband, with little regard for her own desires, pleasure, or right to refuse. Men could engage in extramarital relationships, while any misstep by a woman was harshly condemned by society. This double standard intensified the psychological pressure within marriage. The social and legal systems also blocked women's economic independence. Property, inheritances, and personal earnings a woman possessed before marriage were lost upon marriage, making divorce or leaving the home nearly impossible. As long as a woman remained economically dependent on her husband, she could not challenge his authority. Victorian marriages, therefore, deprived women not only of physical and emotional freedom, but also of financial autonomy. In this oppressive environment, women's inner lives were submerged in silence. Dreams, desires, and passions were often suppressed, shaped solely by the needs of the household and family. Women could not express themselves or voice their unhappiness, and many lived their lives in passive acceptance. Men, even when aware of this silence, often continued to prioritize their own comfort and interests. These striking aspects of Victorian marriage created a sharp contrast between appearance and reality. Outwardly, life seemed innocent, respectable, and orderly, but behind the facade lay women's psychological oppression, helplessness, and unhappiness. The public image of the virtuous family concealed women's lives bound by chains and the reality of love denied. Women had to quietly struggle within the roles imposed by society, having lost both their freedom and their identity. In the Victorian era, divorce was an almost impossible option for women. The legal system was so rigid and biased in favor of men that a woman seeking to escape her marriage had to provide extraordinary evidence. Adultery, physical abuse, or serious neglect could be grounds in her favor, but proving these offenses was often extremely difficult. Finding witnesses, filing a lawsuit, and financing legal proceedings were beyond the reach of many women. As a result, most chose to remain silent despite unhappiness and mistreatment. Attempting divorce brought social stigma, isolating women from their families and social circles. If a woman did manage to divorce, her chances of remarrying were severely limited. Society labeled divorced women as failed or flawed, making it almost impossible for them to be accepted as respectable marriage prospects. Consequently, many women preferred to endure years of unhappy and oppressive marriages rather than face social ostracism. Their silence was not only a personal survival strategy, but also a mechanism that reinforced the unequal distribution of power between genders in society. Widowed women faced another set of challenges. Although the death of a husband brought a measure of freedom, it often imposed new economic and social dependencies. Widows frequently received only limited inheritance, leaving them socially isolated and economically vulnerable. This created pressure to remarry, as remaining single subjected them to social stigma and limited opportunities for financial independence. The plight of widows starkly highlighted male dominance and the secondary status assigned to women in Victorian society. When the women's movement began to challenge the oppressive structure of Victorian marriages, progress was slow. Women had to struggle for years for voting rights, property rights, divorce rights, and inheritance rights. The fight was not only for legal change, but also to shift societal attitudes. Gradually, women gained access to education, employment, and independent income, seeking to break the unequal power dynamics embedded in marriage. This struggle marked the beginning of a long and difficult battle against the dark and oppressive realities of Victorian marriage. Today, the oppressive aspects of Victorian marriages serve as historical lessons. Laws, social pressures, and societal norms that deprived women of freedom limited their lives for decades, relegating love and happiness to secondary importance. Yet this dark picture also reveals women's resilience, their quiet but determined resistance, and their enduring spirit of struggle. Women fought silently and invisibly, yet tirelessly, for their rights. Victorian marriages were a system in which love was secondary, women's freedom was restricted, and male dominance was reinforced by law. Women were forced into silence, obedience, and patience, while men enjoyed the privileged benefits of the same system. The difficulty of divorce, the isolation and social stigma faced by widows were among the most striking indicators of this inequality. Yet history also records the long-term struggle of women against this oppressive order. Through slow but steady progress, the women's movement began to illuminate the dark realities of Victorian marriages and reclaim rights for women. Viewed in this light, Victorian marriages were not merely personal tragedies, but also a critique of social structures. Women were forced to suppress nearly entirely their pursuit of love, freedom, and happiness, while rigid societal and legal norms persisted for decades. The quiet struggle of women was the key force in breaking this oppressive system, forming the foundation for the ongoing fight for equality today. One of the most striking aspects of Victorian-era marriages was the long-term psychological impact this institution had on individuals. From childhood, women were trained to be obedient, patient, and selfless. This preparation transformed into genuine psychological pressure once they were married. Women were forced to suppress their desires, dreams, and personal ambitions, shaping their entire lives according to their husband's will and society's expectations. This created a persistent internal conflict, stress, and unhappiness for many women. Domestic violence was one of the most visible manifestations of this psychological pressure. Women faced not only physical abuse, but also emotional and psychological oppression. Constant criticism, belittlement, and control by the husband undermined women's self-esteem, making them feel worthless. Often, women could not file complaints, as society expected them to protect the family, viewed divorce or separation as shameful, and economic dependency prevented them from taking such steps. As a result, many women had to endure years of unhappiness, fear, and loneliness. Society praised women's sacrifices and silence, rewarding them with the ideals of the virtuous wife and good mother. Yet behind this supposed virtue lay the reality of lost freedom and personal identity. Women, while outwardly representing the perfect family, were internally imprisoned emotionally and psychologically. Men, however, were not bound by the same rules. They could exercise freedom both inside and outside marriage, taking advantage of societal and legal privileges. The near impossibility of divorce intensified the psychological burden on women. Even in cases of marital discord, abuse, or mistreatment, women were often forced to remain silent. Attempting to divorce meant facing social stigma, the risk of losing their children, and financial insecurity. Consequently, Victorian marriages became a system that physically, emotionally, and economically imprisoned women. The rise and development of women-es movements should be seen as a response to this oppressive system. By fighting for education, property rights, and the right to divorce, women aimed to dismantle the unequal power dynamics within marriage. This struggle sought not only legal reforms, but also a shift in societal attitudes. The rights women gradually gained through slow but determined efforts revealed the dark realities of Victorian marriages and redefined women's place in society. Today, the oppressive and unequal structure of Victorian marriages serves as an important historical lesson. Women were forced to suppress love, freedom, and happiness, constrained by both society and the law. Yet this dark picture also highlights women's resilience, quiet but determined resistance and struggle for rights. Despite societal and legal obstacles, women fought for freedom and equality, leaving a lasting mark on history. This detailed analysis of Victorian marriages not only provides a historical overview, but also emphasizes the strength and inspiration modern societies and women fighting for equality can draw from the past. The psychological and social pressures women faced offer crucial perspective for understanding the institution of marriage today. The Victorian era serves as a powerful reminder of the value of love, freedom, and individual rights, illuminating the dark realities of marriage and shedding light on contemporary social struggles. The daily life of women in Victorian-era marriages provides one of the clearest windows into the pressures that shaped their existence. From the moment a woman woke up, she was responsible for maintaining the household. Making beds, airing rooms, cleaning, and preparing meals filled the early hours of the day. The comfort of the household members and the proper reception of guests were entirely her responsibility. Managing these tasks efficiently was considered a mark of virtue. Any shortcomings were seen as personal failures and could damage her social reputation. Women's social lives were also heavily restricted. How a woman behaved in public, when she could go outside, whom she could speak to, and what she could wear were constantly monitored. Expressing personal desires, sharing opinions, or developing individual interests was often frowned upon. Women could not act freely. They existed only within the boundaries approved by society and their husbands. This constant oversight created psychological pressure, forcing women to live with extreme care, caution, and restraint. Within the household, a woman's role almost entirely erased her individual identity, making her dependent on her husband's needs and desires. Satisfying her husband was both a societal obligation and a survival strategy. While men could preserve their comfort and freedom, women lived under continuous scrutiny and anxiety. Their suppression of personal desires, endurance, and silence was praised as virtue, yet in reality it functioned as a chain that robbed them of their freedom. Sexuality and emotional relationships were another area of control in Victorian marriages. A woman's sexuality was considered a duty to satisfy her husband's needs. Women had no right to express their desires or to refuse intimacy. Society interpreted such actions as immoral. Men, on the other hand, were not held to the same standards. They could have extramarital affairs and continue such behavior with little social consequence. This double standard greatly intensified the psychological pressures on women. Victorian marriage also reinforced women's economic dependency. Women lost control over any property or income they had before marriage and could not achieve financial independence even if they sought divorce. This made them entirely dependent on both their husband's authority and societal pressures. Many women viewed silence and endurance in unhappy or abusive marriages as the only viable path to survival. Another source of pressure was social stigma. Divorced or widowed women were labeled failed or flawed, socially isolated, and often faced economic hardship. This isolation created further pressure to remarry or remain silent. Society used these social mechanisms to control women's freedom and enforce their obedience. Despite all these pressures, Victorian women quietly resisted. Their struggle for education, the right to work, property rights, and divorce allowed them to assert their place in history. Over time, their persistent efforts enabled women to reclaim rights and challenge the unequal power dynamics in marriage. These struggles laid the foundation for modern movements for social and gender equality. The details of daily life reveal that Victorian marriages were not merely a historical fact. They were a force that directly shaped psychology, social structure, and women's lived experience. While women had to suppress love, freedom, and happiness, men enjoyed the privileged advantages of the same system. This reality exposes the dark side of Victorian marriages, the social inequality embedded within them, and the profound psychological pressure imposed on individuals.